I'm happy for the people who want to like sit at home and listen to podcasts all day. Those people are great.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the very first episode of our brand new podcast show, Pepper Spotlight. In this show, you're going to listen to some of the most amazing personalities in the content space, let that be digital marketers or content creators or freelancers. And we're going to address some questions like, are we moving towards a digital content renaissance? What's the future of content in India? Are we moving towards like a passion economy? What really does passion economy and creator economy really mean? And some other questions revolving around the content space. My name is Pawan Rochwani, and you might have seen me in some other podcast shows or across the internet, maybe. But I have collaborated with my friends at Pepper Content to host this show. And every week, we're going to talk to some amazing personalities from the digital world to know how they have made a mark in the content space. But to not take much time into this episode entirely, I want to introduce you all to the guest of the episode, the very first guest on Pepper Spotlight. And I think nobody apart from this person would have made more sense um, to be on the very first episode of Pepper Spotlight because we are talking about the audio space. We are talking about how the podcast industry has been in India in the past few years and how it's going to be in the next few years. And I think nobody apart from Amit Doshi, who's the founder of Indus Vox Media Podcasts, can be the better person to talk about everything about podcasting in India. Without taking much time, let's speak to the person who has produced more than 70, 80 podcast shows in multiple languages across multiple genres, and is known like someone who is making India listen to podcasts. You will listen to my conversation with Amit from here onwards. And if you're new to our channel and if you're new to this podcast show, please just consider subscribing to our YouTube channel or if you're listening this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts, Hubhopper, any of these other podcasts, and just like hit that follow button so that and the subscribe button so that you can listen to all these new episodes that come out every week. But without taking much time, let's jump into the conversation with Amit. Thank you so much, Amit, for giving us your time and being on Pepper Spotlight's first ever episode. We don't know anybody else who could have been better first guest for the podcast entirely other than you. So thank you so much for giving us your time.
Very, very kind of you to say so. I'm glad to glad to do this. Very happy to do this. Admire your company a lot.
I'm going to ask you something that has been on our mind, and also we were wondering about if we should start a podcast show altogether or not.
Mm-hmm.
I think you are the best person to answer this. How has the podcast consumption been in the last few years in India, and where do you see how it's evolving currently, or maybe how do you see it happening in the next few years?
So I think that it is still very much in a very, very rapidly growing phase. Right, we still haven't hit the quote unquote hockey stick growth that people look for in this kind of stuff. I think that hasn't happened yet, but having said that, we're on our way there, right? I mean, like, we're seeing more and more people listen to podcasts, talk about podcasts, discuss them in their day-to-day lives. It's absolutely growing at a phenomenal rate. From a pure numbers perspective, I would say that our monthly number is probably close to 40, 50 times what it was 4 years ago. So yeah, I've got to say that's growing dramatically fast.
And what has been the consumption trends? Like, are we seeing consumption just like in metro cities, or we are also seeing the rise in regional podcasts? Because I know IVM produces some
Mm-hmm.
Tamil, Marathi, and other regional language
Sure.
shows as well.
So interesting question. What are the trends, right? So initially, when we first started, right, I would say about 70% of our traffic came from Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore. Okay, a couple of years into that, Hyderabad became another major center itself, right, of people listening. So up until a couple of years ago, about half of our traffic was coming from these four cities. That has started to become less and less, even though on an absolute number, they are also rising, right? The number of people who are listening from Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore, Hyderabad is also growing. But it is still nonetheless, we're seeing that growth is outpaced by what we're seeing in quote unquote tier two cities and such, right? And so, yeah, we have listeners all over the country now. I mean, like, you name the city and there's somebody listening. It's definitely expanding in terms of that, right? And a corollary to the fact that it is moving out of the major metros is that we're seeing incredible growth on regional language content. So regional language audiences are bigger than our English language audiences, right? I don't think that this is something that is unknown, or is it a surprise or anything of that nature, right? We know this, right? We know that regional language content is definitely larger, no matter what the platform is, right? From an audience perspective. But the question is, how do we reach them? And I think that we're getting there now.
And what are the kind of the shows, or let's say the segments in which different podcast shows are? I think you produce shows in which are, let's say, comedy, entertainment, in the marketing space, or even I think
Mhm.
one show is about public policy and everything else. So, what are the broader categories that we are seeing podcast shows now in?
I think podcasts work in all kinds of categories, right? I think that the thought that podcasts are only going to work in certain content types, I think that is part of what limits it, right? I think that there is incredible growth opportunity in being able to create shows in all different kinds of spaces, right? We have shows in so many different spaces, like public policy, as you mentioned, right? We have stuff in finance, we have stuff in technology, we have stuff in comedy, we have stuff in, like, poetry, we have entrepreneurship shows, we have shows around marketing and content, we have shows which are travel, self-help. I mean, like, we try and create stuff in all these different spaces, because I think these various different spaces are where it's part of the benefit of podcasting as a medium, right? If you will. What it does is it allows for people with people who are attracted to certain types of activities, and they might not have huge ways to kind of interact with like-minded people, and it gives them some place to kind of do that, right? And so I think that's one of the powers of the space.
So, like as IBM, and are you building up that supply side to fulfill the demand of consumption that's happening right now in country, or let's say in the coming few years?
So that's a good way to think of it, right? I mean, like, without supply, how can there be demand, right? And India has always traditionally suffered from a lack of supply, right? So, I mean, the way that we have approached the business is, yes, fundamentally this, right? How do we create as much supply as possible at a reasonable cost from a production perspective, and but with a wide enough spread that as many people as possible can kind of really get into it, right? So we have approached it from a supply side, because the thing is that if you try and approach it from a demand side, then you're you're laying out expense before you have this, right? Because, well, I mean, like, to break out the euphemism, expanding from a demand side means spending money on marketing, right? That's what that means, right? And spending money, extensive money on marketing in a crowded media landscape, right, is difficult to justify until you can start seeing some traction on the supply side.
Is podcasts, or let's say audio content, still considered as mainstream content, or no, it's just like, let's say, blogs, YouTubes? Because I see some brands, like I think Bumble recently during the pandemic, they announced their podcast
Mhm.
show with Kanish Surka. I think WeWork
Right.
also came up with their podcast show during this pandemic itself. So
Mhm.
do you think now podcast is also like, or let's say audio content is considered as like one of the key kind of mainstream content?
Not yet. Not yet. We need to get there, but we're not there yet. Uh, The thing is that audio content, and this is not just podcasting, even music and radio to an extent, right, are considered in some way second class citizens to the equivalent text and video available in those markets, right? So, television takes a much bigger chunk of revenue than radio does, right? Similarly, YouTube takes a much bigger chunk of available revenue than someone like a Savangana, Spotify, or IVM does, right? And so I think that there's a lot of growing up to do in the spaces yet. I mean, like, there's a lot of this, but we have issues which are not related to the content type per se, which have essentially slowed down the potential of audio content itself, right? They're primarily regulatory issues, but it is one of the big problems that we have in the country.
And do you think, like, as you were saying, that the money that's generated, let's say through radio or through television, is the difference is way too much? What can, let's say, radio do in order to, be in a more monetizable kind of a business model? Because I think with podcasters also, if somebody wants to be a full-time podcaster in India, they do
Mhm.
consider about how can you monetize this. So what do you think are the probable options?
So I think monetizing radio is radio has structural issues, right? So how are we going to get radio to be as monetizable as television? That's a really complicated question, right? If one, it's not going to get to the same level. I think, like, we should have realistic goals of what are possible and what are not. Fundamental problem with radio more than anything else is a regulatory problem, right? So the way the government of India issues licenses in radio, right, is it's at an exorbitant cost. And these licenses are created with a caveat of no news and current affairs content allowed, right? This was one of the fundamental reasons why I started this business itself, right? Because I saw an opportunity because of that. But when no news or current affairs content is allowed and the cost of the radio station is so high, in the last auction that happened a couple of years ago, these numbers might not be exactly right, but they're somewhere in the ballpark, right? The Delhi FM station, the news stations, were at 180 crore rupees for licenses. The Bombay and Bangalore stations were at 150 crores for licenses. That's an incredibly high number. Now, what happens over there is that all of a sudden you set up the financial aspects of how you run a radio station in a way which is really difficult to kind of, like, break even on. You're forced. I mean, like, radio in India has two genres, right? Essentially, current music and nostalgic music, right? Because those are the only two things where you can kind of generate the kind of revenues you need to generate to justify the investment in the licensing costs. Let's contrast the Indian radio market with the American radio market. Okay, much more lightly regulated, but much more lightly regulated. Uh, in the let's take the two biggest cities, right? Bombay versus New York City. Bombay has 11 radio stations. New York City has 140, right? So just the amount of content being created like that, the amount of stuff that you're seeing like that, right? Or the possibilities that exist with that amount of liquidity of content is fundamentally different than what we have in India, right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
because of that, you have no choice. You have no opportunities for experimentation, because again, who's going to experiment when you have to spend 5 crore rupees a month just to justify your cost of license, or you have to acquire that? How can you invest? How can you experiment when that much revenue is required no matter what?
Yeah, I was wondering because a lot of, now radio stations or RJs, they also have started their YouTube channels or being very active on social
Mhm.
media. And now the advertisement that happens through radio is sometimes not just on the station or, let's say, on that FM, but also
Mhm.
on social media where their RJs, go to those events. So they have kind of clubbed their business model and the ad model in a way that not just radio, but also
Mhm.
social media and maybe offline events also.
Right.
So is because of the complications of the revenue model, do you think that's why they are now also moving into an video space or
No,
an offline event space?
no, I think that when you're looking at the RJ function, I don't think, or when you're looking at the RJs individually, right? I think that's the individual aspect of it, right? I don't know that that would be the case. But what you can look at is you can look at a group like HT and their creation of HT Smartcast, and how they're looking at podcasting seriously or digital audio seriously. You can look at the fact that Radio Mirchi has rebranded itself as Mirchi, because they are no longer just radio, they're going to be audio and social media content across the board, right? And so I think that those are more indicators of the trend that you're discussing, where they see that they need to be available in more mediums than just over the air. But yeah, I think it's an inevitable march of time.
Got it. Got it. Um, Talking about the whole revenue model, and I want to come down to
Mhm.
like the basic aspect of the the main content of podcasting itself.
Mhm.
So apart from, let's say, the topic or what this podcast show is going to be about, what are some other things that are very, very important when you're starting a podcast show, or if somebody wants to start a podcast, apart from, let's say, the topic or the genre of the show, what are other
Right.
things that are very, very prominent?
Write out what your first 10 episodes are going to be. One of the biggest challenges I have with people who come to me saying, I'd like to create a podcast, is many people confuse what is a good podcast episode with what is a good podcast show. Write 10 episodes out, right? And I mean, like, I don't mean obviously write them out in the sense that script them entirely, but write out what you see is going to be the content over your first 10, 12 episodes, right? Because that will impose the discipline necessary to ensure that that what you have is a sustainable idea, right? Because I think that's where a lot of podcasts fail, to be honest, right? Where you'll do 4 episodes, 6 episodes, 8 episodes, and then you're out of ideas or what have you, and then at that point nothing happens further, right? So I think that's the big that's the big learning that I have, right? That it's important to separate out what's a great idea for an episode and what's a great idea for a show, right? And I think that's something that a lot of people fall on. Other than that, I mean, like, I don't think that there is any magic bullet, right, in terms of, like, what will make a podcast work or not. Host knowledge of the subject is absolutely essential. Host curiosity is essential. Amount of prep work that the person is willing to put in is essential. These are all factors, right? But I think if you stop making podcast episodes, your podcast is done. So I mean, like, that's like, a all or nothing kind of factor. Most of the other things are all contributory.
And how, when you were mentioning about the host curiosity and everything else,
Mm.
so how important is also the production quality or sound editing or all
So
those
I
things?
believe it's important. I believe it's very, very important, right? Because in my mind, the production quality is, you don't notice good production quality, but you notice bad production quality, right? And when it comes to podcasting, I think that providing, we all listen to this stuff with earphones in. It's an extraordinarily intimate medium, right? And so having, like, random sounds come in and, like, that kind of stuff, that's not what you want, right? You want a good clean sound. Let's see, look, for example, I can shoot a video on on my phone. That's a video, right? But it's not a Sanjay Leela Bhansali film. They're two different things in that sense, right? Even though both of them
Right.
are under the same subset, right? They're not, they're in some ways the same thing, but they're not at all the same thing, right? Similarly, I think, like, one of the things that always annoys me whenever I see an article about podcasting in a newspaper, at least an Indian newspaper, is the first thing that they say is that, hey, you can do a podcast too. All you need is a mic and a recorder, right? And that drives me a little nuts, because while it is true you can record your voice with a mic and a recorder, how you build a podcast show, that is something. And again, I'm not trying to say that you can't do it by yourself, but it takes time, it takes effort. It's doable by an individual. It's not that it's not doable by an individual, but you need to be willing to put in the hours, right? I mean, each episode is
Yeah.
going to take, like, probably close to a dozen hours to kind of edit, produce, put together good descriptions, all that kind of done. So you got to be ready to put in that time.
Yeah, and the reason why I was asking you that question is also because I keep reading and listening to people that it's so
Mhm.
easy to create a podcast. You can start your podcast in 60 seconds, in one in 1 hour, whatever
Uh,
that is. But to keep going on, with your episodes, with your
mhm.
shows, and do this for weeks and weeks, months, years, is something that will fetch the
Yep.
results, because distributing and promoting the podcast show is also not that easy, right? I mean, it's
No,
different
it's.
from how you promote your social media graphics or something like
Mhm.
that. What what do you think like are ideal, or let's say some of the best practices that people can use to distribute and promote their podcasts?
So for distribution, the world has become a lot easier than it was when we started, right? I mean, like Spotify allows anybody in now. Same with Savan and Ghana if you want to submit there. Initially, we had to go out and work with them and talk to them and strike individual deals to get our content over there, right? But from a distribution perspective, in some aspects, some things have become easier. There's still always going to be edge distribution cases, which I think that as a company we'll probably be able to do in ways that other people will not always be able to replicate. An individual will not always be able to replicate. Uh, but having said that, how do you promote your podcast? It's an interesting question, right? It comes down to one fundamental difference in my mind between how we interact with our phone on most content we consume versus how we interact with our phone when it comes to audio content. Audio content is almost always consumed with headphones on and your phone not actively being engaged with, right? You hit play and then you put your phone on pause or you put it on sleep or whatever, put the phone in your pocket and you go about your work. You go about doing whatever you are. Social media content, video content, web pages, all of this stuff, you are actively engaged with your phone when you are consuming this, right? And so what that means
Yeah,
is that there is a difference in how so like if you want to promote a video piece on YouTube or on Instagram, it's just a click, right? If you want to promote an audio piece on Instagram, it's not just a click,
yeah,
because nobody's going to want to click right then and there, because you're asking them to context switch out of engaging with their phone to now putting on headphones and listening to something, right? And getting people to context switch like that is really difficult. So how do you
yeah,
do that, right? How do you kind of promote that? The way that I think makes sense is you build the brand, you promote the brand, right? You make it so that the brand is such that people remember the brand, and when they are ready to listen to a podcast, "Arey, I remember hearing about that show. Yeah, maybe I should let me give that a try." Right? Rather than expect direct funnel math to work over here, I think trying to build podcast listenership like that is the more appropriate way. And the other thing is engage with the audience. Engage with the audience, right? I mean,
yeah,
your
yeah,
podcast fans are as passionate as you could possibly believe, right? I mean, like if somebody is giving you 40 minutes of their time to listen to their conversation, right? Then to listen to your at that point in time, you know that they're a fan. They care about what you have to say, right? Nobody's just doing that for the heck of it, right? So definitely engage with fans.
got it, got it. Something that, I wanted to ask you when we were talking about how important, different aspects of a podcast show are, and we were talking about the host and the host curiosity. Do you think if like how Bill Gates recently,
Hmm.
started his podcast show, The Big Questions. Do you think if
Yes.
people in the Indian ecosystem, and if celebrities start their own podcast shows, will we get more listeners and the users will grow?
It happens to an extent. It's not going to be it's not a direct transfer. There have been numerous podcasts run by celebrities internationally which have not worked, right? So I mean, it's not always that a podcast is going to work no matter what, right? Just putting a famous face over there does not guarantee success. Now, having said that, uh, influence helps. I mean, let's not be naive about this, right? Bill Gates doing a podcast, or Amy Schumer doing a podcast, or Shaquille O'Neal doing a podcast, or I mean, like this stuff helps. There's no question about it, right? Because you already have an audience, right? You are somebody who has millions of people following you on whatever social media platforms, and so it's not inconceivable for them to follow you from one platform to another platform. So it definitely would help. I mean, like in our case, we do shows with so we have active shows with Cyrus Brocha. Besides that, we do a show with Ronnie Screwwala. We do a show with Ambi Parmeshwaran, very well known author, writer. We've done shows with Ayaz Memon, Maruk Inayat, who is a ex-television journalist, fairly popular. We do a show with her. So we try and figure out, we try and figure out as many people who are with as much influence. Is definitely something that we look at when we're trying to roll a podcast out, what kind of social media influence they have. But yeah, I mean, like, it is definitely it's definitely there, right? I mean, like, fame helps. There's no getting around it.
Got it. Yeah, and in fact, I mean, if somebody has like 1 million followers on Instagram and they put up like a swipe up story, at least 1% out of them will go and
There
listen
you
to
go.
the
Exactly.
podcast. So that definitely helps.
Yep.
Talking about on similar
Mhm.
topic, like recently Spotify has been creating great shows in terms of
Mhm.
podcasts, not just Indian podcasts, but also Michelle. They started a partnership with Michelle Obama.
Yep.
The Joe Rogan Experience is now available on Spotify only. Or yesterday, I read in the newspaper, Harry and Meghan are going to start their
Yep.
new podcast, which is going to be about entertainment and some these kind of conversations
Right.
exclusively on Spotify. Do you think like Spotify is going to be like a place not just for music but also for podcast now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, that is a big part of what their plan is, right? I mean, like, Spotify is absolutely looking at podcasting as a core part of their business, and they should, right? I mean, like, there is I'm guessing many of the listeners on this podcast will probably know who Ben Thompson's stratechery is, right? And he has this really beautiful analogy, right, of a one-time cost versus an ongoing cost, right? An incremental cost versus a fixed cost, if you will. And when it comes to music and it comes to these apps, every play is an incremental cost to them, because if they play a piece of music, they have to pay a record company a certain royalty, right? Whereas most podcasts for them are fixed costs, right? If it's their own acquired podcast, or if it's something that that they have created and pushed out themselves, they pay for it once, and then after that, every play does not cost them money on it, right? So podcasting as a business for a OTT audio app just makes a ton of sense, right? Especially if you have music, because the more people who move from music to podcasting, especially in a market like India, right, where we are well under what we should be from podcast consumption perspective, right? So the more people you can push from one area to the other, I think the better off they are.
And for us, let's say as podcasters, do you think then we should like focus a lot on Spotify, or do you think we should still be omnipresent, be on JioSaavn, Ghana, Google Podcasts, everywhere else, even on YouTube?
So my own personal opinion is that we should be platform agnostic. We should not care where people listen as an independent podcaster. Obviously, this is not the case for somebody who works for Spotify or somebody whose show has been acquired by Ghana or Savan. Excuse me. But as an individual podcaster, my own personal inclination is that we should be platform agnostic. Where you listen should not matter. We should be wherever people listen. There are certain benefits to this. There are certain challenges with this, and this might not be for everybody in some ways. Because I mean, like, when you start thinking of the revenue opportunities as we go forward, clearly Spotify is going to be a revenue driver for a number of different publishers, right? And so if you as a publisher do not have the ability to go out and sell your own advertising or create your own product in terms of subscription or what have you, then maybe Spotify or one of the other competitors might be the right answer, right? But I think that for the ecosystem to be as healthy as possible, it's essential that there be as many different platforms to consume on as possible.
Got it. Two small sub questions on
Sure.
the same context. I've seen some podcasters also, starting their shows and then listing it on Patreon or any of these other, exclusive subscription platforms where listeners have to pay $1 a month or something like that to listen
Right.
to their podcast. Do you think then for independent or let's say full-time podcasters, that should be like a medium to follow, or they
I
should
think it
still
should.
be there on Spotify?
That doesn't preclude you from being on Spotify. A Patreon model allows you to be on Spotify and to be independent as well. So I think that that is an interesting model. Whether it is micropayments, whether it is Patreon style, early access to content, whether it is pure subscription content, right? Ben Thompson, again, who we just mentioned, right? He has a paid podcast, right? It's $5 a month that he does with John Gruber, who does the Daring Fireball. Sorry, I can't remember the name of the podcast right now because I'm not a subscriber to it, but it's doing really well for him, and it's $5 a month.
So,
Right?
like, you mean they should, let's say, list down the first 5, 6 minutes on Spotify, but the whole podcast should be available exclusively on
Well,
Patreon or.
no. So it depends on how you apply Patreon, right? Most podcasters who are using Patreon are using it as a way to get early access to content, not as a way to. It's not so it's available eventually on Spotify, but it's available on Spotify maybe 7 days later, or 3 days later, or 4 days later, depending on what the kind of show is.
Got it. And the second thing that I wanted to ask you was, as of now, there's no, let's say, censorship or any
Mhm.
restriction to what kind of content you put out in your episodes. And
Mhm.
maybe that's why we can do some paid promotions or brand partnerships through our
Right.
end. But eventually, let's say if these restrictions and censorship do happen on Spotify or any of the other audio
Mhm.
platforms, then do you think it will drastically affect the independent podcasters and
Well,
creators?
yeah, can you expand on that a little bit? Are you saying that Spotify would not allow us, or Spotify would not allow us to place ads in our content?
Yeah, I mean, let's say if I do advertisement of OnePlus or any other different product,
Right.
and the audio platforms would not allow because they will have an integration of automatically placing ads on our episodes and our podcasts. Do you think
I
it
think
will?
that I think if they go down that route, they'll find out very quickly how quickly they piss people off, right? Because it's not like I get money from Spotify today, right? I mean, like we don't get paid by Spotify to put our content there. It's a
Yeah, yeah,
exchange of equals, right? In that sense, we are giving them the ability to push to publish podcasts, right, including our own, and they are giving us additional distribution. The second that relationship changes, there will be, I mean, like it will play out in whatever way it does, right? I can't
yeah.
predict how it would play out, but there would definitely be ramifications. So do those ramifications include things like me making only one episode available on Spotify, or me pulling the content from Spotify altogether? I don't know what the answer to that is, right? But there would definitely be ramifications for any platform which tried to say that you cannot run your own advertising unless they're paying you. You pay me, and then we're fine. I can give you an ad free. I can give you ad free content if you pay me what I want, right? But if you're not paying us what we are looking for, then why would we be okay with this?
Got it, got it. One last question, and then we'll move on to more like a fun set of what we call as a lightning round or a would you rather
Okay.
set of questions. Uh, I'm pretty sure a lot of creators who are connected to the Pepper community, they would, want to start their own shows or, just at least try their hands at podcasting. What are, let's
Sure.
say, three tips that you want to give to aspiring podcasters before they start their show?
So first thing is what we already spoke about. Write out your episodes. Right. Write out an episode plan, 10, 12 episodes deep at least. Make sure you have a show and you don't have an idea for an episode. I would say that is the first and most important thing to do, because that's the biggest problem I face when I get incoming proposals from people who want to do podcasts. Besides that, I would say the other thing to do is you need to know the subject you're going to speak about, because there are there are essentially two kinds of podcasts, right? There's a scripted, written out podcast, and there's a conversational podcast. Now, maybe I'm biased, but I prefer the conversational podcast, like the two of us talking right now, right? This is my preference. In a conversational podcast, you cannot fake your expertise. It is not possible for a host to not know anything about what he is talking about and to be able to get by. This is not
Yeah,
a 3 minute television interview or a 5 minute television interview. This is a long conversation where you are reacting to what I am saying, I'm reacting to what you are saying, and if you don't, as a host, know what the guest is talking about, it will come across in the content, and you will lose the trust of your audience at that point in time, right? And I think the third thing that I would say is, be when you're looking at the kind of show you want to do, right? Not every show needs to be like the Zara Hatke idea, right? You don't have to like be different for the sake of being different. But at the same time, don't. don't let the conception of your show be just I want to talk to interesting people, right? That's a lazy conception.
Yeah.
Why do you want to talk? Why do you want to talk to these interesting people? What is it that you want out of them, right? And it could be as simple as I want to learn how they did ABC, right? But don't just like I want to talk to interesting people so I can. A podcast is not a substitute for a social life.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I'm gonna tweet this and I'll tag you that a podcast is not a substitute to social life. And I'm sure everyone who's listening or listening to this or watching this, they'll take these tips about before they start the podcast. Moving
But I
on to
should say
more.
that listening to, I should just add that listening to a podcast is fine if you substitute your social life for. But I'm just saying that if you're trying to be a podcast host, you shouldn't think of it as a substitute for your social life.
It's series of like 7-8 questions where whatever first comes to your head, like spontaneously, let us know what you think about these.
Sure.
uh, the first question is, if the following people will start their own podcast shows, what would they name the show? The first person
Okay.
is, let's say, Shah Rukh Khan.
Uh, I'm gonna suck at this, man. I really am. I'm gonna suck at this. Shah Rukh Khan. Let's think. My name is Rahul. I don't know, man.
Ranveer Singh.
uh, Insanity.
Priyanka Chopra.
This is not Quantico.
Last, Virat Kohli.
Uh, Paternity leave. I would actually love for him to do a show about like paternity leave. That would be awesome.
Yeah, yeah. The next question is, like, what would be some of dream guests for you to, be on your any of the podcasts that
Oh
IVM
wow.
produces?
Okay. So I mean, like I would have to say number one answer is always going to be Amitabh Bachchan because I'm a 40-year-old dude living in Bombay. So that's always going to be the number one answer, and that's not going to change. But beyond that, I mean, like yeah, actors are interesting. I think I would love to have a long, extended conversation with Mani Ratnam as a filmmaker. I think because I mean, like it's just such a vast body of work, right? And it's like literally 35, 40 years in the making. So I mean, like it would be fascinating to hear like his recollections of stories. On the political front, I would love to talk to. Well, I mean, this is I'm no longer alive, but I'd love to have talked to JP Narayan way back when. Uh, let's see, who else would be interesting? What are the other fronts? I don't know. I mean, like the thing is that we're fortunate enough that we're able to get a lot of people to come talk to us, right? Outside the top line film stars and cricketers, right? Outside that, a lot of people have been on the network, so we get to talk to a lot of people. So difficult for me to come up with people who I haven't spoken to yet, or we haven't had, or who would be like who are unapproachable in that sense.
Got it, got it. What's your favorite all-time favorite podcast?
Of all time, interesting. All time favorite podcast, man. Limited series. I really, really, really liked what the BBC did with the assassination. I thought that was just an incredibly well put together show. Another one which I like that's really well put together has come out recently called Undercover. It's a Pushkin Industry show. It's about an FBI agent who goes undercover in the 80s with a biker gang. And the story from that, I really like that as well. Conversational shows, I mean, like my favorite ones are probably the Bill Simmons show. I listen to Larry Wilmore whenever I can. I like a bunch of tech stuff. So, I mean, like, I listen to This Week in Tech, Pivot, Exponent. Wow, this is like Ben Thompson Central, isn't this entire episode? But yeah, no, he does a great podcast in Exponent as well. So yeah, I mean, like all kinds of stuff. But I mean, like I love NBA podcasts. So I mean, like, a big basketball fan. So I listen to Open Floor, which is a Sports Illustrated podcast, very regularly. I listen to a podcast called Real GM fairly often. I listen to 48 Minutes fairly regularly. So I like to listen to quite a few of NBA podcasts.
And what's like your one all-time favorite episode from any of the podcasts? Like one
Oh
that you
wow,
always
okay,
like
that's
revisit.
so. You know what? I don't revisit all that often. You know what? Okay, God, Ben Thompson needs to pay me some money. Ben Thompson, about a year and a half ago, he did an episode on the economics of the podcasting industry, and I heard that one twice. I listened to it once, and then I got back and I heard it a second time.
Wow. Okay, I'm gonna listen to
Yeah.
that. What's like this is the new question. What's your favorite genre of podcast?
NBA. I mean, like from a pure enjoyment perspective, I like. So the thing about NBA podcasts, right, is it's just the NBA in general. It's like a grown man soap opera, if you will, because there's so much drama happening all the time over all kinds of silly shit. But it's fun, right? And so the people who are creating these podcasts as well, like, they're fun personalities: Zach Lowe, Bill Simmons. Yeah, then I mean, like, Ben Golliver. These are fun people to listen to. How it's just fun. So yeah, I would say the NBA is probably my favorite genre. I enjoy the celebrity interview, but I find those to get a little repetitive over time. But NBA, I mean, like, as much as that just keeps, like, every episode is a new episode is new because they're talking about what just happened, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. What's like one question you would want to ask to your favorite podcaster? Because we are mentioning Ben Thompson so much.
Okay.
Uh, what is one question you would want to ask him?
That's an interesting question. So I would like to really, thinking about how did he decide? So yeah, his business model, right? It's like he's the first, like, independent analyst who's making like millions of dollars a year, right? From a newsletter. He's like he is the idea that sparks Substack, essentially, right? So I mean, like, how did you think that this would work? I
Yeah.
just think about it, right? How did you think that a general technology newsletter, you would get thousands and thousands of people to pay you $100 a month to do? How did
Yeah.
you think that that was even a possibility? I'd love to know that.
Yeah. Okay. Uh, Rank these forms of content in the order of that you like them.
Okay.
Books, YouTube, podcasts, blogs, and newsletters.
Books and podcasts are one and two, and I would say they pretty tie each other. I mean, like, it's for me, either or. I love to read. I love podcasts as well. Um, the others were YouTube.
YouTube, blogs, and newsletters.
Okay, so I think blogs and newsletters are the same thing. I don't really think that there's a difference between both of them. It's just that, I mean, like, the form of distribution is different, right? But newsletters in its modern form is what a blog was 15 years ago, right? So I think of them as the same thing in that sense. I like watching a lot of YouTube as well. I watch a surprising amount of YouTube. Whether it is, comedy stuff, or whether it is like learning stuff, or whether it is yeah, I mean, like, I watch a ton of YouTube. So I would say books and podcasts are both tied for one, and the other two are all tied for number three. The other three are all tied. I like all of it, right? I mean, like, I read a lot. I read a lot of newsletters. I read a lot of I used to read a lot of blogs. I don't read so many blogs anymore because nobody publishes blogs anymore. But I used to read a lot of blogs. I was one of those people who was super pissed off when Google Reader discontinued. And YouTube works really well for me for entertainment and for education. So I mean, like, if I want to understand how a piece of new software works, YouTube is my go-to for that, right? If I want to watch some silly stand-up comedy, YouTube's my go-to for that.
And this one is going to be like a small sub question and the last question. Would you
Okay.
prefer like consuming audio only podcasts or also like video podcasts?
Uh, it really comes down to, we spoke earlier about phone in the pocket versus phone in the hand. It really comes down to what I'm doing at that time. If I'm in a phone in the hand space, then video. If I'm a phone in the pocket space, commute, workout, chores, then audio. I don't sit at home and listen to audio. You know what I mean? I do it a little bit now because of pandemic, and now I have to listen, and I'm at home all the time. But earlier, before the pandemic, I wouldn't come home at night and listen to a podcast. I'd come home at night and watch television, right? So I think it really depends on what behavior you're in, what you're doing at that point in time. If I'm
Uh,
looking for just sitting and chilling, then television, probably video in that case.
got it, got it. Amit, I think I could go on and talk to you about podcasting and everything else, what you would like, and just try and note down all the names of different podcasts that you have been talking about. But for the interest of time, and I think this entirely has been like a very enjoying and insightful conversation for me.
I'm
And I
glad, bro.
hope it is for all the listeners of Pepper Spotlight as well. So I just want to thank you once again for giving us your time and talking to us about everything related to podcasts.
Not at all. Happy to do it. This was great. Looking forward to seeing how the rest of these shows start showing up. I'm hoping that I hammered into you that you need a show and not an episode, so that you will be having some. You'll be continuing to do great episodes. But yeah, no, I really look forward to seeing what you guys come up with.
Thank you so much, Amit, once again, and we will be in touch with you. And if anybody wants to reach out to you, where can they DM you or
So
your
yeah,
ID?
yeah.
Or
Twitter is good. I'm Doshi Amit on Twitter. But yeah, I mean, I'm Doshi Amit everywhere: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, wherever. It doesn't matter. Yeah.
Great. So anybody who wants to ask any more questions to Amit, you can just directly reach him to on Twitter or on Instagram. And once again, Amit, thank you so much for giving us your time today.
No, not at all. Happy to do so.
I hope you all enjoyed the very first episode of Pepper Spotlight. To know who is going to be the next guest on our show, please just subscribe to our YouTube channel or wherever you listen to your podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts. But to give you all a slight hint about who the next guest is going to be, he's someone who is an expert in creating viral video content. Like the person has known how to achieve virality in terms of content and unseen organic content, and this person also believes that content marketing is the exact opposite of advertising. Very interesting personality and a very very interesting conversation this is going to be about the whole content space. In the first episode we spoke about audio. In the second episode we're going to speak about video content. So I hope you all visit us again next week. And if you don't want to miss out on these episodes, just hit the subscribe button on the YouTube channel or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you're listening to this or watching this. If not, just stay in touch with us on our socials. It's @pepper_content. Very simple to remember. But I'll also just attach the link of this in the description of this episode. And we're going to end this first conversation. And thank you so much once again for listening to this and watching this. We'll see you next week again. My name is Pawan Rochani, and check out the link in the description of this episode if you want to know the summary of the episode. You're just more like a reader rather than a listener, so you can also read a blog that's attached with this. Take care and stay home, stay safe.